You're listening to A Creative Excuse, presented by Hecho a Mano. Up now at Hecho a Mano is a group of 6 printmakers from Oaxaca City in Mexico called Grabados Oaxaqueños. That's on view through November 24th. And then our next opening is November 29th. It's called Regalos, and it's a group show of over 50 different artists, a lot from Santa Fe, from New Mexico, and abroad. Kind of small works, gifty things for the holidays. This episode is Sydney Cooper. Sydney is a wonderful artist living here in Santa Fe. We had a great conversation, and you can learn more about her work at sydneycooper.com. And as always, rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts to A Creative Excuse. It really helps. And thanks so much for listening.
Great.
Well, thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, me too. I feel like we've orbited each other for a long time, but never really got to know each other at all.
Absolutely.
And to me, this podcast is great. That's the perfect setup. It's oh, I see you around. I feel like with AHA, we kind of did a little bit of things together.
Exactly.
And then I remember, I don't know if it was the first year, but you had a Jewish-Japanese market.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was fun. I think I didn't flesh it out as much as I'd like to.
Uh-huh.
But it ended up, what I've learned about events and performance is to be open and spontaneous and improvisational.
Right.
So I had a whole intention behind that, which on the day shifted, and it totally worked. And
yeah.
It was, what I meant it to be was sort of a commentary on the concept of Indian market or Japanese Jewish market or Spanish market or, every day is gringo market in Santa Fe in some spaces, not necessarily in yours.
Yeah.
So it was meant to be a commentary, but be somewhat lighthearted.
Yeah.
And it continued to be, but what I realized was that I ended up having conversations about, well, who are your people? Where do you come from? What do you do? How are you? And so I bring materials. I was just talking about someone who loves tools. Mm-hmm. So I brought a lot of materials, and what I ended up doing was self-portraits with people, me standing in the booth with Japanese Jewish market behind me, and then my conversational partner holding up their lineage.
Yeah.
And so it became this conversation around identity. Uh-huh. And I was also serving, I found, believe it or not, a miso matzo ball soup recipe.
Really?
Yes.
How cool.
It's totally delicious.
I bet.
I'll share it with you.
Yeah.
And so I was serving people miso matzo ball soup as an example of what this hybrid could be.
Yeah. Right. Well, it's, I don't even know if I were to dig into my lineage, English, Irish, German market, I don't know.
Exactly.
But it's interesting to think about, a commercial market based on race and heritage.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And then when I looked into it, I found, of course, there's a Japanese Jewish restaurant in Tokyo.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And then there is this whole, I don't know if you know about this identity concept coming out of Hawaii called hapa. And it sort of means half, but it's come to mean mixed. And so there's hapa everything. There's a hapa photography project. And I think the New York Times just did something on mixed race being an identity rather than a deficit necessarily, or a not quite here, not quite there. It actually being a place to work from, be from, live from.
Right, because I think, some of the artists that I had known that work from that place come from an idea of feeling pulled or not being able to settle into one, or feeling that kind of the uncertainty of the middle ground.
Yes.
But I like the idea of feeling solid within that middle ground.
Yeah, and I think both finding commonalities maybe from the cultures that you're from and experience. Also, I'm a Californian, which is a major, aspect of my identity. But I was educated for college on the East Coast, which is a big part of my identity, and I've lived in New Mexico for a very long time.
Yeah.
So I think things emerge, just around thinking about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And depending on the culture you're from, I have a ton of African American friends who identify as African American, and everyone identifies them as African American, but they're half. And I say, it's so interesting that you will say, I'm African American, but I would never walk around and say, I'm Japanese American.
Right.
Period.
Right.
Or I'm Jewish American, period. It's interesting, the depth of the racism around certain cultures.
Right.
So you're not even allowed to really occupy that middle ground.
Huh. Yeah, I wonder what that's about. Do you have a sense of like is it somewhat based on like how others might react or see you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And
yeah.
I think it's it's part of the, profound racism of our culture.
Yeah.
And at the same time, as an artist, I'm interested in how we perceive things, why we perceive things. And though I'm absolutely cognizant that, again, in our culture, racism is such a profound and present presence, I also look at how we see things visually, how we perceive things, what our response is to the unknown. And so some of the relationships, for example, I see people all of the time looking at me and deciding in New Mexico that I am indigenous, that I am Hispanic, Latino, that I am in California. People make other assumptions about me, that I'm Middle Eastern or Filipina or all kinds of different cultures. It's very comfortable for me in New Mexico because I almost never have to answer the question, what are you?
Yeah.
Which in most other parts of the world, people ask me on a daily basis, many times over. Mm-hmm. So it's part of the comfort of being here for me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't ever get that question.
Right. What are you?
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's an interesting idea to think about, like I don't have to justify myself based on race, right? Like nobody asked me that. It's like the quote unquote norm, right?
Right.
And I think that gets back to what you're saying about the racism in this country, and thinking about that as almost like a seed, in a sense that it's like that was such a core component of how this country was able to get to where it is.
Absolutely.
Based on
the entire
slavery.
Basis of our economic system.
Yeah.
And I love that is really being talked about, played out. The data around it is irrefutable in terms of the concept of reparations.
Yeah.
Which I'm fully in support of. And of course, I think of our indigenous brothers and sisters. Like, what about, in addition, their reparations as well? And I don't think one precludes the other. Mm-hmm. But I'm looking at you thinking, just from what I know of you, that, as a conscious, present white man, I'm sure you get a lot. You hear a lot in the background about white men, right? Mm-hmm. And white privilege, and
sure,
which we know is real. And at the same time, how do you work with that in an honest way? Because it also must hurt in a way if you're working to be present and conscious.
Yeah, and I think the hurt around it isn't necessarily like, it doesn't for me come from a place of feeling guilty about anything. It's about empathy. Mm-hmm. I feel the pain of like recognizing like, there's a privilege there that other people don't have, and it causes them a lot of pain.
Yeah.
And I think, and so that's where for me any discomfort comes from. And I think the way that I try to approach it is just by listening.
Sure.
Like I'm, especially at the gallery where I'm working with indigenous artists, where I'm working with Mexican artists. I'm not there to insert a narrative.
Right.
I'm there because I really appreciate the work, and I want whoever the artist is to, be sharing wherever they're coming from.
So how do you integrate that into your practice in terms of working with an artist? And do you ask them, what would you like me to say about your work? Or would you like me to share what you've written or what you've said? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think it started with like studio visits with just relationships, getting to know the artist. And then, as far as the kind of outward facing sort of story about the work, and I think that just comes through talking about it.
Sure.
Like when I write like a press release or something, like there's a back and forth that goes on, am I telling this story correctly?
Right.
Is this how you want your story to be told? And so, and I don't really put out a lot in terms of didactics. I get that they're necessary in a lot of cases, but I'm also just interested in like how people respond to the work itself.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of conversations, like when Ian had a show of the cut paperwork that was all around Mauna Kea. I talked to a lot of people about that
didn't know anything about it.
Didn't know, or like, oh yeah, something's happening up there, and so there's a great sort of opportunity to kind of have those conversations, live wire, and so that's been really great,
That's really amazing. And so you were saying you're often quiet. So that's pretty, it must be pretty draining if you're a quiet person to be having these multiple conversations all day long. And yeah,
it is. I'm generally an introvert in a lot of ways, and but I'm in a position where I'm talking to the public a lot.
Amazing.
And it pushes me in really good ways. But there are certainly days where I'm like, I do not want to talk to anybody else. I'm most comfortable alone.
Yeah.
To be honest,
Interesting, yeah.
But I also know that like I need stuff like that to push me. I want to grow, and so.
Like this podcast.
Like, yeah, totally. I mean, it's funny. I think you've already asked me more questions than I've asked you.
Oh,
which is fine. Totally
okay,
fine.
sorry.
No, it's great. 'Cause I actually, I think I would like these to be more kind of back and forth.
Sure.
So I went to school for studio art and had the intention of, working as an artist, and ended up more kind of going into the realm of holding space and galleries and nonprofits and things. And there's a way in which I feel like I can hide a little bit behind other artists' work. And this podcast has been kind of vulnerable in a way because I'm sharing myself.
Right.
But, I'm also like, it's Sydney.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I've learned a little bit about listening in the past couple of years. I learned from some friends this concept of levels of listening, what we normally hear, and then what is possible to hear if you really get your voice out of it, pull your voice out of it. So that's probably why I'm asking you more questions. I'm also thinking that being in a space like that, as I was saying about the sort of performance of doing the Japanese Jewish market, I'm wondering if you're improvising in a way too, which is like, well, the last person I talked to them about it this way, but I felt like maybe this was missing. Do you do that? Do you change things up?
There's some of that. I think I'm probably a little bit more mechanical than I'd like to be. Because sometimes, you come up with this spiel and it's like, oh, that sounds good, I'm going to use that, and then I just sort of repeat it,
Sure.
And it's also just like, gauging levels of interest too. I found that to conserve my energy, like I have to really pay attention. Like, are they actually interested?
Right.
Otherwise I'll be even more exhausted at the end of the day.
What do you say when someone walks in to gauge their interest?
Well, I say hello to every single person that walks in. And I just watch. I watch their body language. I watch what they're drawn to, how quickly they're walking through the space. I mean, lots of people just kind of spend about 15 to 30 seconds and then walk out.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what I'm doing isn't necessarily what some people expect when they go to Canyon Road. So I think
Thank you, by the way.
Yeah.
I'm so excited. There feels like in your contributing, there's a shift.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a little bit happening on that
Mm-hmm.
corner
Mm-hmm.
specifically.
Mm-hmm.
That's nice. So it's just paying attention, and if they come in and they're really excited to be there, I try to mirror that.
Mm-hmm.
I try to mirror them.
That's really interesting.
And as far as sales, like it's the same thing. It's just mirroring what they're drawn to.
Yeah.
Oh, I really like that. Oh yeah, isn't it great? And just reinforcing what they're sharing with me rather than like, oh, look at this thing, you should have it. You know what I mean?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. There was something about what you said that reminded me of this image I saw this week, which I found so compelling. I don't know if you saw it. It's from the editor of the Brooklyn Rail, and it was on Instagram. And it was a photograph he was sharing from someone else of Jasper Johns leaning in with the cane, leaning in, looking very close to a Via Salmon's painting, I believe at the Whitney. And what was so compelling was seeing, I didn't know who it was, but I was like, that is someone who looks at art. And then hearing it was Jasper Johns looking at a Via Salmon's, both of whom I admire very much. I felt so privileged to be part, just a, passive observer. There's some interesting things happening, I think, on Instagram and in other spaces around work and looking at work.
Yeah.
Good for good and ill. That
Right.
was an example of something really compelling that I wouldn't have seen unless I was there.
Yeah, I find that like with Instagram in particular, it can get easy to like get into the scroll.
Yes.
That quick scroll by. Yes. And I think what it reveals to me is how easy it is for me to get into that zone and be like, oh, I don't like that. Like I want to pay closer attention.
Right. And it also privileges a certain kind of work that's easy to take in a tiny image, which is definitely not what my work is about. And I've had difficulty about that because it is experiential and about standing in front of the thing or the experience or interacting with it.
Well, and light interacts with it in such unique ways.
Yes.
Like I was looking at your website today and you have multiple photos of the same piece because of the way light shifts it.
Yes, definitely. And that doesn't come still close to the experience of being with it or living with it, because some of them are silver that are unsealed and they'll actually tarnish over a period of years. So there's sort of the short time of being in front of it, but the longer time of living with it or even walking around it. And then this longer duration with some of the pieces of them actually oxidizing and kind of like our skin does.
Yeah.
Aging.
Yeah.
In real time.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry about my website. It's really out of date, but there's some fun
It is
stuff.
out of date.
Yes,
and you should put new work on.
I'm going to. I am definitely going to. But there's some fun stuff. Did you see the video of the raking?
Yeah.
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 That was super fun. But that's also quite a while ago, and I have a ton of work since then. It's interesting how I'm just arriving at this place of. As a 54-year-old woman who's been working for a very long time, realizing, I am now at a place where that I'm entering a commercial realm. I am talking to people about showing my work in a different way. I sort of hung back and stayed out of it for a long time. for various reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But it's been really interesting to talk to different people about their paths, and knowing very intimately my father's generation and their path, which is part of the reason I stayed out of it, I think, is just the seeing some commercial elements as being restrictive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think the whole world has changed since then. And one of the things I say to myself is, oh, maybe you sort of hung back a little long. You could have jumped in a little sooner, but whatever, here I am.
Yeah. Well, and what kind of struck me is when you said, 54, do you feel like you're at a place where you're sort of speaking more clearly
Absolutely.
through your work?
Absolutely. And speaking more, just standing more squarely where I am.
Mm-hmm.
I think different people have different paths, and I've followed, if you can imagine, like sort of a foot race, and seeing a bunch of different lanes and different people in different positions. I feel like different aspects of my life have held those different lanes, and one thing will move forward or back slightly.
Yep.
And I think when you're taking on a lot, which I've done in the social sphere, in the political sphere, in the creative sphere, in business, as being in a family,
Mm-hmm.
raising horses, being on boards, I've done a lot of things and learned a lot of things in this parallel way, so that now I think, I feel at 54, I have some mastery under my belt.
Yeah.
Which is different, I think, than being the kind of person who has maybe one or two channels and they're moving those two things forward. And it's really helped me to understand my own process.
Yeah.
And also helped me to talk about why I'm where I am today.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I mean, I don't think... it's funny. Gallery work actually snuck up on me in a way, which shouldn't have, because I've been in galleries for 11 years.
Sure.
But I never thought like, oh, this is something... Like, it always sort of felt like a means to an end in a way. Like, I always had side gigs that I was more interested in. And... having the ability at Form and Concept to actually have a little bit of curatorial control, it kind of opened me up in a way. I was like, oh, I like this.
Yeah.
I really like working with artists. I like understanding where they're coming from and finding ways to hold space.
Absolutely.
And then when that sort of that Best of Santa Fe thing came out about that, it really was a beautiful validation.
Great. Not
that like award rah rah rah, but just like, oh wow, like there's recognition, like, oh, it's not just me.
Right.
Like, I mean, I think I liked it.
Sure.
But I get, wow, other people are digging it too.
Yeah. It's so rewarding, and I relate to holding space. I've been was on the board of the Santa Fe Art Institute for 10 years, seeing it through 3 different directors and very different visions. But I was completely committed to holding the space for other artists. And I've never done a residency in my life.
Wow.
Yeah. So I can relate to the reward and the creativity, actually, that holding that space is. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I see, many, many fields within the arts and other fields that are equally creative to people who call themselves artists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to, like, for me, a lot of the practice is about getting out of the way. Mm-hmm. And I was talking with Bess Murphy. Do you know Bess?
No,
at the Co Center? Mm-hmm. The Co is it was a private collection, now public collection, and the collector had like 2,200 different objects, mostly from North American Native.
Oh, amazing!
And it's a hands-on collection, so you can go and make an appointment and touch and hold anything there. And that was what a lot of our conversation was about. And for her as a curator, especially as an Anglo curator within indigenous objects, is really just, how do I get out of the way? How do I get out of the way and let these objects speak? And I think it's really important, because it's not having a space like that isn't about gratifying my ego or oh, look what I put together. I love artists and art, and I want to put it out there. I think it's really important.
It's clear the way that you present things that's the case. It's the only way to be involved.
Yeah. So you grew up in California, Los Angeles?
I grew up all over California and was born in Los Angeles, yes. And I have to say, as much as I love New Mexico, when I fly in to Los Angeles or San Diego and I see a palm tree, I feel like mother, right? There's something about the air, the light, and the flora and fauna that really draws me, and a million things about the way culture manifests there.
Yeah. Your parents were they artists? Are they artists?
My father's an artist and lives in Taos, and my mother doesn't identify as an artist, but I would say that's her, what?
She's a creative person?
Very much, yes.
Yeah.
But I wanted to say, it's sort of like, what is it? I just sent her for her birthday, which was yesterday, watercolors and black and white paper and some good brushes. And I said, let me see something psychedelic. So my mother really, as a young woman, inspired a lot of other artists, which is interesting, and kind of dropped it.
Is she just very private about the work that she makes?
She's Japanese American and inherited a good amount of sort of cultural modesty, I would say, which is interesting. I strangely inherited a little bit of that too. She was born in a relocation camp in Colorado during the war. So also, if you just think about the implications of being someone born in prison, it is profound. And it takes a lot to forge your way in unknown territory. And I think it was just something she didn't want to take on. Yeah. Maybe she was born with enough, challenge.
Yeah. But she makes things.
Yeah. And they're great.
Yeah. And what does your dad do?
He's an artist. He lives in Taos, is very associated with the Southern California light and space and surface scene, and has had a really interesting path, is making work coming from those roots again in his 70s. His primary medium right now is cars.
Interesting.
He got into art from loving cars, and probably finishes, but more the cars, and a bit of surfing, and sort of moved into that scene, as many of the mostly men who were in that scene did. And he came out to Taos in 1980, I would say, and has been here ever since. And also in the interim sort of created this incredible marketplace for mezcal, which is a big, long story. But yes, so my father is an artist, and so I guess I'm second generation, as is my sister. Yeah.
And did you, was that kind of something that you recognized from a young age, that you were like, this is something I really resonate with?
No, I let's see. I'll tell you something about me. The first thing I wanted to be was an Egyptologist. The second thing I wanted to be was journalism. The third was middle-aged brain. Marine biology. And I went actually to Bennington thinking, I was thinking about biology and art both. So it wasn't really until I was a teenager that I always was making things, but everybody in my family were making. It was like being Balinese or something. Everybody makes things, so it's not special.
Uh-huh.
But I realized I lived there in some way as an adolescent.
Lived in a creative
in that space of making and the what I now understand as sort of mindful space.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And timeless space,
Mm-hmm.
and just seeing it as a place where I can put my experiences and observations. That's really what I think is valuable to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if many people know that about artists necessarily, because we are all so focused on objects or experiences. But and I know for artists, it's old hat discussing it with each other.
Sure.
But the process being so compelling.
Right. Well, and I think that's really what it is about for most artists,
Yes.
probably.
Yeah.
That the object is just sort of an artifact, an art
Yes. Exactly.
fact
Yes.
of the process, right? Of, digging into whatever's making you tick and seeing that reflected externally and going back and making adjustments and redoing it. And in my experience, it was a way of knowing myself,
Sure.
and curating it is too.
Sure.
Being honest about what drives me and motivates me and interests me refines, how well I'm able to put something together.
Absolutely.
And the more honest I am about it, the better it is.
Absolutely. And I had this experience at a Matthew Barney retrospective at the Guggenheim. And actually, I find it hard to look at art in the Guggenheim in general because the building is so overwhelming and wonderful. But the slant of the ramps, gets in my visual way all of the time, in a good way and a bad way. But I was looking at a Matthew Barney retrospective, and there's that self-portrait he did. I don't know if you know, but he's wearing these big pink feathers fluffing out of his
I've seen it.
head, giant and topless and with body makeup and this grotesque mouth. And I remember just looking at it and thinking, not thinking, it just came to me in that synthetic way that art thought works. Art experience works. Oh, all art is self-portraiture. Oh. And then I started looking around, and then I just, carrying that thesis forward, looking at other work, looking at film, looking at dance, listening to music. Through that lens, it hasn't left me that thought.
Yeah.
That even something completely seemingly minimal has its qualities, and it's a million decisions that have gone into it.
Yeah.
And that reflects so much the maker.
Mm-hmm.
Even something that like someone intends not to have any touch or hand whatsoever, that tells me something.
Sure.
Right? Or the level of touch or representation or color sensibility or sound or whatever it is.
Yeah. Do you find that you're able to get a sense of how honest those marks are? I mean, I feel like sometimes I can like it just seems like that doesn't seem right, like that.
Yeah, and at the same time, I have been so wrong, or maybe right in the moment, and then over time, something that I thought maybe was dishonest really speaks to me, and I realized like, oh, I was just in a completely wrong place to receive it. Or but then there are loves, right, that you have from the beginning also that never leave you, that are so profound, and I find that so rewarding. So that is an experience we've probably both had in different ways, but when you have that experience of seeing someone totally connect to a work of art that you think is really great, that you're showing, and you see that it's passionate, right? The engagement and the wanting to know more, and where is this from, and who made this, and what's it about, and sometimes acquisitiveness, sometimes not, but curiosity. I always want that kind of engagement, and it's so wonderful when it happens.
Yeah.
And I can never predict it, either from myself as a receiver or someone receiving what I'm doing.
Yeah.
But it is so clear when it happens.
Right. And it's like it becomes about that communication. I mean, you were talking about art as self-portraiture, but I think when it really hits is when it speaks, right? When the other person opens and listens and hears and sees themselves and like has that kind of communication and connection.
Exactly. And I think that's part of the communication and connection. Like the phrase, the personal is political, right? I think for artists, the personal is political and universal. Maybe not to each individual at every single moment, but you are absolutely, if you're committed, going to connect with, I don't know what the percentage is. I wish I had a sense of
to quantify, like, what percentage of people are going to get it?
Well, yeah, I say things like, and I keep asking the question, what percentage of people do most of the work in the world, right? So we all know people who do kind of, as I said earlier, a couple things and are satisfied with that, and that's perfectly justifiable and wonderful. I don't have a problem with it. But I do have the experience that I see in politics or in fundraising or in whatever local communities, that there is this minority of people who are, of course, completely overloaded, but who are carrying the weight of, I don't know how many people.
Right.
So I kind of think that number is like 10% of people carry, 90%.
Yeah.
Of the load, that needs to be carried to move things forward.
Yeah.
Maybe it's more people in different situations, but I'm interested in that question anyway.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly see that, in work environments or whatever, or like, being in, high school or with a group and like one person does the report or whatever.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Or in the nonprofit environment where everyone is maxed out usually, and often incredibly generous and talented and working for not enough money. I've noticed there tends to be not personality type, but people of tremendous capacity somehow seem attached to that world, attracted to that world.
Yeah, and yet don't get the compensation they deserve.
Which is ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, I think about teachers, hi Mom, she's probably listening. I mean, she's one that is, she really cares and busts her ass, and just, I think it's a real crime, the way that teachers are compensated.
It is. And were I king, queen of the universe, I would upend that hierarchy immediately.
When did you start recognizing that art was like a path? I mean, I guess maybe you did know that, but or start working on it yourself, rather.
I can remember going to the Boys and Girls Club, and it was Girls Club after school, maybe in 5th or 6th grade, and having these teachers who did very crafty projects with us. And I came from a family that loved craft, and I don't use craft as pejorative in any way. Yeah. I'm very, very engaged in craft. Love it. But I realized, I'm good at that. Teach me the thing, I do the thing, and then I'm teaching the kid next to me or working with her on that. So I think it was sort of in the girls' club structure, and I love Girls Inc. locally. I went to a fundraiser for them, and I found myself in tears. I realized, that's a place where I really found myself. And I really want to support that organization, and I do. So yeah, I think spaces like that are so invaluable. And then in high school, but it took me a very long time to commit to a vision of myself as an artist, because I've mostly disagreed with the way artists are portrayed. Also being a woman.
Starving, struggling, depressed.
Yeah, well, and often like a white guy in a garret with a woman who's suffering and supporting him. Yeah. And I was like, well, how the hell am I going to identify with that? That's not my paradigm. But wow, what a beautiful world we find ourselves in now. And I say find ourselves in, but through great struggle and strife by countless women and men and people who identify however they identify, banging on the glass ceiling and walls and the box and knocking it out. And I'm so thrilled about where we stand now.
God, what a time.
Isn't it?
It's nuts.
It's amazing.
It's really
It's
crazy.
amazing.
Yeah.
I love it, and I'm so happy
about
that. Of course, there are things in politics that are really upsetting, but that is coming from the people, right? That is not top down by any stretch of the imagination. That is something that we have created ourselves, and I'm really thrilled and proud of that for everyone.
Yeah. Did you do the art school thing? Did you?
I went to Bennington, which is a liberal arts college in southern Vermont, and I actually was accepted at Cal Arts and Art Center, and was planning, and UCLA and a couple of places I was thinking about going to. But I asked my father's peers what they thought about art school versus regular college, I guess. And there wasn't one artist who said, I think art school is a good idea.
Interesting.
Now, it's that pool and that selection, and
Sure.
it's a specific group of people in a specific place and time. I think that might be different now. But the real, I think of one person, Eric Orr, what he said to me was, all the artists I love, their work is coming out of ideas from other places. And the manifestation is in the field of art, but the ideas are very rarely coming from art itself. And I found that compelling. And there's something, when I receive something that feels like a truth to me, not a universal truth necessarily, but a truth to me, I feel it and I know it and I trust that. And that was a moment where I heard and felt that and acknowledged that.
So were you making things at Bennington as well?
Yes.
While you were
so I was going
biology?
Going from biology lab to sculpture class, walking just across a little lawn, and of course realizing what one is meant to realize when you're learning about learning, which is it's just different languages, different processes, and different materials. What do you want to be? You want to be a doctor? Fine. It's still a process and materials and information.
Yeah.
You want to do it in sculpture? There you go. And the difference for me, I think, was imagining myself in, which many scientists have told me I wasn't creative enough in my thinking about this, but I imagined myself in a fluorescently lit space doing some sort of lab work and writing grants, night and day.
Yeah.
But I know there are a lot of scientists who don't work in those spaces.
Sure.
And I was interested in genetics, so, I might have landed here anyway at the time. But going to sculpture class, and I'm not a sculptor, so that's kind of interesting, or not necessarily a sculptor. It was going through this process, having sort of a thesis, an idea, and seeing it through, but then there being this object at the end to hang one's ideas on that sort of remains as a sort of holder of meaning.
Yeah.
And I think in science, that process, still one is known for their work and you move through that process. But there was something, as much as I said, art is not about object for me.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about the object as not exactly the word I want to use, but sort of receptacle, holder of meaning and of process and of evidence of thought that was really compelling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I still, I think it was it Rauschenberg who, no, it wasn't Rauschenberg. He said he operated in the gap between art and life. I think it was Oscar Wilde who said either in art or in life. And I feel like I'm operating in a different sphere, which is all of it is art and all of it is life.
Yeah, more Alan Caprow.
Yeah, there we go. Perfectly placed. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. What are you working on now?
An office building. That's one of the things I'm doing. I have made my living as a contractor, doing decorative painting and plastering and things like that. And I've loved that because it's collaborative and physical, which I love those two things. And my artwork is not so collaborative and not so physical necessarily. So I don't know if you saw in my bio, but I say I've worked with materials such as communities, buildings, just to list and to sort of create that visual framework of art and life being simultaneous for me. And one of the things that I'm doing, embarking on funneling a lot more energy into, for lack of a better term, an art career. If you turn around, I'm narrowing that field to maybe 3 lines. And they all are different manifestations of similar ideas and inspirations. So generally, I would say working on painting, drawing, and collage in a way, utilizing the same ideas. And just seeing, exploring what the manifestations are in those different spaces.
When you were talking about the physicality of contracting, it made me contrast that and think about, with science or biology, you're not necessarily using your hands in the same way.
Yeah. You
right?
could be.
Yeah, sure.
One could be. I mean, when I was a teenager and went out with marine biologists on boats to study whales, that's very physical and fascinating and wonderful. And you know what? Given 6 lives, I definitely would pursue that.
Yeah.
Also, so I think some of it is just arbitrary, right? I think some of it is revisionist history, storytelling about one's life because of where we find ourselves.
For sure.
But I say to my children who I love and adore, I can imagine a great life without you too. And that's not implying, infanticide or something, but it really is that I can imagine not having children and living a fantastic life.
Right.
And that is not to dismiss them or condemn them. It is just to say, like, I love you being here, but, Mom's got other stuff that really I find compelling.
And, I mean, life is so much about kind of like, those choices that we make and kind of just rolling with it.
Yep.
I mean, for me, it's like I'm interested in a lot of things for sure. And there's a sort of pain of choosing in looking at all the other things that you don't choose. Right. And yet at the same time, I think there can be a sort of universality in that I could probably learn the same lessons from a lot of different things.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that this particular path that I'm chosen, it's like you said, it's kind of arbitrary in a way. I mean, it certainly resonates with a lot of specific things about me and my personality, but there's whatever lessons I needed to learn could probably be done in multiple ways.
Absolutely. And it's also not buying your own hype, which is necessary in certain spheres, but that's not what this conversation is about, right? So, I mean, that's how I'm taking it.
Uh-huh.
I actually did with David Hershey, who was an artist who used to live in New Mexico. Yes, he's in Marfa now. Conversation series. It was called First Thursdays,
Mm-hmm.
but it was two artists or people in the art field talking with each other and letting people in on the kind of conversations that happen in these spaces. So that's how I'm
totally
naturally taking your intention.
100%. And that's hard for me to think about doing that in public with an audience. Like that would be a lot harder for me.
Yeah, it was interesting. Yeah, because you can't help but respond to people's physicality and coughing and questions and hard to tune others out in that same way.
Yeah, right. And then, so you're working on maybe diving deeper into your artwork.
Yes, it's also seasonal. We just had our first frost last night, 20 degrees. I'm very compelled by gardening and being, mushroom hunting and being up in the mountains and other things and doing this physical work of contracting. So my time to move inward and work on other things is fall and winter and early spring. And I've been in this cycle for 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
And without interruption in winter, I can get a year's worth of work done.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that I don't work the rest of the year, but I can't work in the sustained way that I can work in the winter.
Yeah. And you said you're kind of narrowing it to 3 lines.
Yes.
If you could briefly, what are those lines?
Well, I would say the gilded paintings, which are gilding on gilding. So they're kind of, the imagery is somewhat invisible and is sort of legible depending on, what the lighting situation is like and where you're standing in relationship to the surface, which I've always felt like is a good metaphor for life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there's a drawing equivalent that I've come up with, which is drawing on aluminum with a backing of wax. And that operates in a similar way, but using different methodology.
But just for the listener, it's not ink on aluminum.
No,
you're making an impression.
Exactly. I'm making an impression into the aluminum, and I draw in a directional way so that different things are highlighted or in shadow, depending on how you move in relationship to the surface.
Yeah.
And then the third way is a bit in question. There are weavings over there of images, the identical image sort of weaving in and out of itself. There's work incorporating photography, and so that's, I guess, that remains. There's some embroidery.
It's very different. I mean,
so that's just the process, sitting with the process and saying, that is where it's like ruthless editing in writing a novel or something like that, where you just have to decide, is this in service of the idea or in service of, I don't know, a way of being or a way of working that makes sense. And I think that's for me, an indicator of someone who's committed to and serious about their work.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I'm loving Ken Price before he died, many years before he died, maybe 10 years. He's a good friend of my father's, and I would be fortunate enough to be in his company sometimes, and I asked him something about his work. Do you know his work well?
Mm-hmm. No, well, not well, but
okay. So one of the things...
More the ceramics.
Yeah, so one of the things that's so awesome about him as an artist is that he worked in this form of ceramics, which at the time was absolutely not considered art by anyone except him and some really enlightened people around him. And but then he also worked in this sort of incredible, slightly cartoonish, based on actually Mexican comics from, I think, Tijuana from the 50s. And sometimes this work would seem so incredibly disparate to me and to others that it would be hard to put it together as the same artist. And one of the things he said was, you kids are so lucky, you can do whatever the hell you want and call it art. And I thought, yeah, that's true, right? So at the same time that I'm saying it's important to perhaps hone things down and see if they really suit your mission, I really support and am interested in kind of wild exploration as well.
Well, I think it takes that to get to a place where you can hone in and say, like, oh, this like we're talking about, making certain choices and the arbitrariness of the paths of life. I think it's, just the art is a reflection of that as well, right? Absolutely. And like, oh, this medium, speaks most clear with what I want to say, or and having that focus.
I mean, I can tell you, I just saw an ad again on Instagram for Hauser and Wirth's show of Philip Guston. Find the video. It's really incredible. And literally my heart starts beating out of my chest. I'm dying to see the show, but B, the way he uses oil paint is so compelling, and it makes me want to paint so badly. But really, oil paint doesn't serve my ideas very well at the moment. Right. Which makes me terribly sad because I love oil paint, But I'd see what he did with oil paint, and it makes me want to quit being an artist altogether. It's just so tremendous what he was able to do. I think there is sacrifice involved too, right? Totally. There is this kind of lopping off a big part of your heart to get at the core of what you're working on.
It's back to editing, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's back to kind of editing your life, right?
Absolutely. Many teachers, in one form or another, have taught me, like, it's very dangerous to protect that perfect little corner that you love so much. Like, sometimes you need to obliterate it to get to it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, it can kind of keep our eyes off of other things that might be more important, or like revealing other things, right? Because we're so fixated on this one little thing.
Yep. And what can you do in that space for real, in the space of time, like at the doing the Japanese Jewish market? I could have just been serving soup the whole day, which is not what I intended to do. But there is something about food and Japanese and Jewish culture that obviously is resonant, but you could say the same as for any culture.
Food connects.
But the conversation led the process, right? So it's also about space and time, where you find yourself.
You probably could list several of these, but can you think of one artist in particular or one exhibition in particular that really changed you in some way, or change your direction, or just open things up and in some kind of poignant way?
God, I'm thinking of someone who is such a now so hard to see, but I'm not going to resist. I'm thinking of Frida Kahlo. Yeah. And, she's become such a cliche and such an icon and such a image. And I often feel focused on there's not a right or wrong, but by my measure, for the wrong reasons. On the plane, on the way to Bennington, as an 18-year-old, I read her biography. And what compelled me so it wasn't so much the work, it was her life as work. The whole, that German term, Gesamtkunstwerk, right? The whole picture, the whole vision of being this incredible political person, a person who reveled in the way she adorned herself, someone who was incredibly hardworking, someone who dealt with tremendous adversity and privilege simultaneously, her creativity in her use of language and love and being bisexual and having beautiful homes and caring about food and caring about her indigenous culture, and being a bridge person. So I think it's not, no, it is absolutely artist as a maker of life. Mm-hmm. A lover of animals, a lover of plants, a lover of, life in the most profound sense. So interestingly, because I think if you looked at my work, you wouldn't see any relationship to her work necessarily, but I think if you look at my life, you would see in different arenas, and some the same, a real love for the entire project of life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think when you come at it consciously, and there's, I think, a real kind of reckoning between thinking that life is something that happens to you versus something that you're in relationship with.
Absolutely.
And that how you respond is really what creates your experience. Can lead to that, right? Like,
absolutely.
I think the more conscious I become and aware and and honest and recognizing that I can respond in any myriad of ways to what shows up, right? That can be that's that creative moment.
Absolutely. And I think about how the model of a liberal arts college as well is a sort of a parallel model. And it's so interesting that you have, your life is made up of shifting gears from one subject to another, from one methodology to another, from one sort of language, the language of your teacher or your peers in each space. And then one is meant to totally artificially move out of that space of this sort of endless possibility and into this sort of single linear vision of how one's going to live one's life.
Right.
And another one of those moments that I had actually at Bennington from an alum, she came up to me. I was making jewelry to put myself through college. And it was like an alumni weekend, and she looked at my work, and we were having a great conversation, and she said, you'll spend the rest of your life trying to recreate this experience. And it really just hit me like a lightning bolt. And I thought, oh, that's true, right? And so that's my experience of life, is that I am wanting that level of variety in terms of my friendships and peers and the materials I work with and the way that I, live in the world. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's a, pretty tall order. Yeah. It really is.
Yeah. Well, I think that, if I were to imagine thinking like, okay, I've chosen my career and this is what I'm going to be for the rest of my life, it would probably be pretty hard to live in that state of possibility, right? Or if I'm under a tremendous amount of, oppression or something, then it would be pretty hard to live in that state of possibility.
Or a lack of possibility. Yeah. And at the same time, I acknowledge, because I have many friends and family who are absolutely comfortable defining themselves in those terms and don't find it restrictive, and find tremendous freedom in a kind of narrowed sense of what they intend to do with their lives, regardless of whether 10 years down the road they're going to switch careers and their whole lives will be upended in some way.
It's a great point.
Right?
Yeah.
So I always have to remind myself that my sort of wiring and tendency and framework is not everyone's.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think I'm with you there. For a long time, I actually tried to make that my framework. Because I thought oh, that's what I have to do. And I never felt comfortable. Yeah. I was always kind of searching for that one thing. And it never, art making was the closest that came to it. But even that was like, I really don't feel comfortable like putting myself into that framework either.
Yeah.
And so I had to really let that go.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was saying about my vision, which was art historical and definitely shoved down my throat to some point, and all of our throats, of this, single male artist working in a garret, blah, blah, blah. It's many of us can't see ourselves reflected in that vision, and hopefully that's I know that it's shifting for younger people. Mm-hmm. I'm really thrilled about that.
Yeah. God, that could be a whole another conversation.
Yes.
Cool. Do you have anything that so you've got your website?
Yes. Don't go to it.
You can get a sense
of what I'm doing. It's just sydneycooper.com, 2 Y's, like Australia. And nothing I'm pitching immediately, but keep your ears and eyes open, because it's, I'm definitely moving out into the world.
Cool.
In a different way than I have.
Yeah. Great.
And the same way that I have. It's just a slight shift in focus.
You made an edit.
Yeah. There you go. Just a little nudge.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. And so cool to get to know you better.
Yeah.